Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Apostate of Mind. I'm Mark Peralta.
Hey guys, I'm Apostate Ann. And today we're going to be talking about a problem that hits you right in the face as soon as you start reading the Old Testament. And that is the problem of the Hebrew Bible painting God in this polytheistic world. For example, in Genesis, it talks about let us, plural gods, make man in our image. In Psalm 82, it says, God stands in the divine assembly among the divine beings. You know, who are these plural gods? And it seems to contradict the Christian God, which is monotheistic, Yahweh is the one and only God. So, what is going on here?
Yeah, and I would advance and say that it doesn't just contradict Christianity, but it contradicts Judaism, Islam, Mormonism, etc., etc. Any religion that it's affirming one God only type of theology, it's problematic. What's essentially happening, what we're looking at is these texts that have these phrases that sounds like there are multiple gods are actually there for a reason. And that reason is because the ancient Israelite religion had a heritage that came before them. And that's part of it, in large part, the Canaanite and the Ugaritic religions that preceded them. And so these religions were actually polytheistic. And so what we're looking at in some of these texts are the remnants of this very polytheistic religion that Judaism came from.
So you're saying there is a polytheistic worldview. Interesting.
Yes, when I refer to Canaan or Ugarit, take a look at the map in front of you, the one on the very left, where I've got that big red circle. That's Canaan. And so Canaan was a civilization that was there around 1400 BC. There would have been these Canaanites that occupied the entire land of Israel and Judah. So you can see more or less the comparison. The map on the right is right around the time of the supposed King David, so 1000 BC. So by 1000 BC, the land of Canaan is now politically divided a little differently, of course. So you've got Israel is one, Judah is another section of it. So my point is Canaan and Israel comes from that same geographical area. It's not like the Canaanites were like these other groups. Like when you read the Bible, it sounds like they were these other groups or these other people, sort of like foreigners.
So it's perfectly reasonable to understand that, of course, of that region, of that time, this was the belief. And that's why we see that influence in the Bible.
Exactly. Yeah. So like these myths that originated perhaps within a Canaanite and or a Ugaritic context carried over into the Hebrew Bible scriptures. So yeah, so you've got this very polytheistic religious background or heritage to the ancient Israelites. And so that then becomes sort of like corrected. That becomes tweaked a little. And I would argue that happens right around when the Septuagint is written, like 400 BC, where much of that Greek influence, the influence of Plato and his understanding of the world, had already put into question the concept of gods being just these personified natural phenomena, right? Like thunder or the ocean or rain and whatever, but that God is more something bigger than that. I think that concept of the omniscient, omnipresent, omni everything is more of a Greek spin of God that then the Jewish religion adapts to it, and then later Christianity conforms to it.
So then it's
That's right.
still, you still have this worldview present in the Old Testament and the Hebrew
Mhm.
Bible. So, how do apologists explain this or make sense of this?
Yeah, so essentially there are two ways that they try to explain that away. But I should mention that I think where it all starts is in the actual translation of the very texts. Like if you open up to Psalm 82, God takes his stand in his own congregation. When you read it in English, that's the NASB, the New American Standard. But when we take a look at it in the Hebrew, not in among his congregation, it says um, among his divine council.
Yeah, congregation sounds totally different. What
So
does
that,
that divine counsel mean?
yeah, so to me, that divine council is one of those remnants of this ancient Canaanite Ugaritic influence in ancient Judaism of the pantheon of El. So uh, the religion used to be where El, there's this god named El, and he's at the very top of this hierarchy. And he's got at least 70 sons, one of which is Yahweh. But then there's also Baal and Asherah and all these other deities.
So Yahweh was one of the sons of El in the Canaanite religion.
Nice. So that name shows up in those Canaanite Ugaritic texts.
Mm-hmm.
And so ancient Canaanite religion was very much polytheistic.
So they explained it away by changing the wording a little bit.
They changed the wording a little bit. They do away with the name of God, so that depersonifies the deity by just calling it God, which is more of a title. And then they completely erase the divine council. It's not his congregation. That just sounds a little more generic. So now that we kind of understand, like, there is this polytheistic heritage to ancient Israelite religion, okay, let me show you a couple of examples of how modern day apologists try to explain this away.
Yeah, I want to hear what their perspective is on why it would be gods and who are these multiple gods or divine beings.
Sounds good. So this very first one here comes from Inspiring Philosophy, is Michael Jones. And he's going to try to argue that, this divine council is not really like these other deities. It's not a pantheon of gods, but they try to play down the whole divine concept, okay? Away, certainly. It's not like there are these multiple gods. It's something else. And the other way that they try to explain away this plurality aspect of God in the scripture, as you mentioned, like, let us let us make man, right? How we explain that away is that there is something about God that's plural, but that's just because God is like more of a godhead, and whatever that means. So, but we'll get to that one. And then I'm interested in knowing what you have to say about that. So if you've got comments, observations, critiques, put them in the comments below, folks.
The divine council is essentially God's heavenly family. We today have reduced everything to God and his angels. But as Michael Heiser points out, in the Old Testament, there is more hierarchy, with God on top, then the sons of Elohim, and then angels. The divine council is essentially a heavenly host of the sons of Elohim. Now that leads to the question as to why does God need it?
Is it heavenly hosts or is it his heavenly family? What, now he has a mom, sister, sons, brothers? Who is his family? Like, what is he talking about? And where does this come from? I haven't heard this before.
Yeah, because you gotta have a heart, man. It's like Yahweh needs a family. he needs moral support because he's not he's not omnipotent or omni everything.
Jesus was his only begotten son. He's got a whole bunch of other sons, daughters.
Yeah,
for backup, just in case.
That's right. So in that regard, that way we should understand that there are some people out there that we're gonna have to be okay with.
So now, are you not only are you having to believe in an invisible God, but now his whole family, and like you just have to trust that all these other gods that are also dwelling with God in heaven exist.
Yeah.
Or heavenly family.
Yeah, because they're not a bunch of gods. They're something else, but just not gods.
And who are these sons of
Yeah.
Elohim that he's referring to in the
Well, I mean,
Christian sense?
oh, right. Yeah. Who are these sons of Elohim? But that's actually incorrect to say, because it's never the sons of Elohim. It's the sons of El. So I don't know what he's talking about. Okay, let's continue.
Need a divine counsel. Well, the biblical authors never say that he does, just like God doesn't need humans, but he created us anyway.
Just because scripture doesn't deny why he needed them or that he needed a divine counsel doesn't mean that he didn't need one.
Right. I mean, especially if he's creating humans with this counsel and judging according to Psalm 82, with ruling and judging with these other divine beings. I mean, surely they have some role in the matter or some need there. Otherwise, why would they be there? And why would God have created them to be there according to this narrative?
All right, let's keep going.
God, being a creative and a relational being, created heavenly beings to worship him and for him to have loving relationships with. This is the same reason we were created.
So now he created them so they can worship him and he can love them. That's why.
He said loving relationships. What the hell is
No,
that?
where is he
That sounds
getting this?
weird. Where we how exactly does a loving relationship in the heavens with angelic beings work? Isn't God supposed to be omnipresent, like he's everywhere, right? And he's not like this one, little guy walking around or anything, but he's like this thing. How is that actually going to work? So here we get off subject, but yeah, so you see how he's relegated these divine beings that we know come from Canaanite, Ugaritic, ancient religious traditions.
Mm-hmm. We see right there how he's already changing their meaning and definition, identity, everything.
That's right. They're just family members. They're just these other messengers. By the way, he didn't really show any scripture to back that up, nor do I think there is
No.
any that would say something like that. They're just doing it because they can't get away and they won't affirm polytheism.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, he denies the possibility that these heavenly hosts or these heavenly members would also be divine. Notice.
Mm-hmm.
But his analogy doesn't do that. Like, just because human beings that have loving, familiar relationships with one another that can worship God does not mean that divine beings like sub-deities cannot fulfill that same function.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Right.
They
And his
don't.
explanation, he's taking away the godly powers of these divine beings. So it doesn't take away from God. But really, the text doesn't say that. And the tradition doesn't say that.
That's right. And he's clearly just playing it down, which
Mm-hmm.
is similar to what Michael Heiser has done in his Unseen Realm. He deals with those passages that clearly are showing evidence of a polytheistic religious influence on these texts, but he plays it down, but he reframes it a little differently. Not only that, but in this video, he's going to cite a source, what seems or sounds like a rabbinic source, but he doesn't do it justice. I think that he gets it kind of wrong, but I'll walk you there.
So there I am in a room full of 40 or 50 senior citizens. They're all Jewish, and I'm going through the Godhead in the Old Testament. And none of them had ever heard of it. I had people in there whose fathers were rabbis and cantors. They had never heard of this. And so they were fascinated because part of the class, I took them through Jewish texts in the intertestamental period as to how this idea was part of Judaism, how it developed, and then, of course, it was a segue, to understanding Christianity.
Okay, so one thing here, what he's trying to do with his little speech is he's trying to argue that there is a tradition of interpreting the Hebrew Bible, namely understanding God to not be a plurality or a polytheistic pantheon type of thing, but more of a what he refers to as a godhead, which I refer to as the godhead fallacy.
So he's trying to say that the pluralism of the gods is actually pointing to the Christian God.
Exactly. And he's going to argue that there's evidence of that tradition of interpreting the Hebrew scriptures that way during the intertestamental period, which is the period between the last book of the Hebrew Bible and when the New Testament of Christianity was written or came into the scene. That period of about maybe 500 years is that intertestamental period. And I'm going to argue that no, there's not evidence of that, of such interpretation, but rather there's evidence of labeling such interpretation as heresy. So, but I'm going to walk us through it because it's actually kind of concerning.
So not only is this not you're arguing that not only is this not pointing to the Christian God, but to say that it is anti.
To claim that Jews were kind of already seeing God this way is what I think that he's wrong.
So it's anti-Jewish tradition.
Right. Yeah. The tradition. Yeah. The rabbinical tradition actually speaks against that or warns people against that.
Gotcha.
Yep. And then also notice, and I don't know what the audience is of this video, but he's given a story that he's talking to a room full of Jews, and they're not like scholars, they're not like rabbis, and he seems like surprised that they don't know about this. And he frames it as forbidden knowledge, which is another thing that's very fallacious because it's not actually considered forbidden. Because when you say forbidden, what does that presuppose?
That you're not allowed to know this from somebody's not wanting you to know this.
Yeah, and that it's actually a thing, you know. So he's actually, in a way, he's arguing that this tri-unity, this godhead of Christianity is actually in the text. It's just that the rabbi said, no, don't read that, you know, because, you know, it's forbidden. It's forbidden for you to know this knowledge. When in fact, no, what is forbidding is the heresy. That's what's forbidden.
And they were fascinated. So just trust me on this. I've met many Jews,
Trust me, bro.
that had no idea that this was part of their theology once. I have since discovered as an academic, this was actually part of my dissertation.
See that it was part of their theology once. That's so false. But I'll let him continue.
That what we're going to talk about today was sort of looked at as forbidden knowledge. There were certain passages in the Old Testament that you shouldn't be reading and you shouldn't be studying without a rabbi with you, to steer you from one direction to the other, to give you the standard interpretation or denial of what the text was actually saying.
Denial of what the text is actually saying.
Right.
So
actually
we needed a
saying.
rabbi to say, no, the text doesn't say that. They're denying that's what he's saying.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to jump in. One of these passages is Genesis 19:24. And it says here in verse 24, then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven. Now, what is odd about that verse? It has, let me look at it. The Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven. The Lord is raining down fire from the Lord. You have Yahweh twice in the same verse, and they look like two different characters.
Okay, so you see what he's doing there?
Yeah. How does that look like two different characters, though? I don't get what he's talking about there.
Yeah, I don't see it either. And in fact, what I found is that rabbis and scholars of and specialists have no issue with that whole repetition because indeed it's actually known as a literary device to kind of underline what it is and what it's not. And in this case, what the author may have intended behind the repetition or the qualifying of the fire is, as I might add, is that indeed it came from Yahweh. Like as if to say that it's not that Yahweh used fire from the earth or from a volcano or from somewhere within the terrestrial plane, but it actually rained from heaven. It came
Right.
from above, and that's
Yeah.
it. That's really what it is. And he thinks that because the name's repeated, then that could mean that there are two characters. I don't see it.
I don't either. I don't see how that points to two parts of God or anything like that.
That's right. Let's see.
And Jewish thinkers and readers, they saw this, and this became part of what would later become known as the two powers in heaven. Here's another.
He's actually incorrect in his interpretation of the two powers of heaven. He's referring to this book by a rabbi, last name Segal, titled The Two Powers in Heaven, which are actually not this concept of polytheism versus monotheism, but rather that you've got competing theology during the intertestamental period that is proposing that there is kind of a sub-deity or a second power that is actually creating the universe and operating and carrying out all these functions, but that there's another God that is more of like the uppercase G God that is outside of the realm of space and time. And actually, the rabbis consider those things or those ideas of two competing deities as heretical. They are not saying that this is some forbidden, like this is how it is, but we don't want you to know, or just make sure you get one of us when you try to contemplate some of these ideas. But rather, it was forbidden because it was heretical, just like certain heresies, just like heresies are forbidden in the Christian church. This dual power, this dual God concept was during the intertestamental period defended and warned against, labeled as a heresy. That's all it is.
Interesting. So yeah, I don't
Yeah.
see anything there. Let's see the next example he gives.
Let's see.
This is the song of Moses after they go through the Red Sea. And we have this line in here: the Lord, Yahweh, is a man of war. The Lord is his name. So even that, the Lord is his name, but the Lord is a man of war. Since other Old Testament passages had Yahweh not as a man, very clearly, and sort of a transcendent being,
That's actually very inaccurate. The texts that describe or where you could interpret God to be a transcendent being, even though that word is not even biblical, like it doesn't show up in the text. Transcendental, what is that? It's not related to passages where the name Yahweh is used. Very much the opposite, where whenever you see Yahweh showing up in the text is almost always a very anthropomorphic type of God. In other words, the texts where the name Yahweh shows up is where God is acting very much like a very powerful human and not this transcendental outside of space and time God, right? Like, for example, the Genesis account of creation, the second account of creation, where Yahweh is breathing air into clay. Unlike Genesis 1, where he just says, let it be, as like he just pronouncing
creation.
Exactly. Yeah. So he's incorrect in that. I'm very surprised. Yeah. There's something else very, very interesting about that text, but I want to let him continue saying what he's saying about it, and then I'll show you the actual Hebrew.
heaven somewhere. this verse sort of stood out in the intertestamental Judaism as significant as portraying the notion that Yahweh would come to earth in human form. And we're going to see how this fit into other passages in a moment. But they looked at this and thought, well, this is explicit. So there's Yahweh on earth as a man whenever that happens. But that doesn't mean that Yahweh is still not in heaven and everywhere. So
How
apparently,
so? That's exactly what that means. How are you, if you're here on earth, how could you be in heaven and how could you be everywhere?
It actually is contradictory, like logically, and you cannot affirm both.
Mm-hmm.
That's the problem. But they want to reconcile those two ideas.
Right.
All right. So this text, Exodus 15, verse 3, which reads, "The Lord is the warrior, the Lord is his name." That's the Jewish Publication Society translation, which gets closest to, but still, notice how you've got the word Lord here, which is indeed Yahweh.
Mm.
And Yahweh is God's the name of this God, right? And the text itself affirms that Yahweh is his name, which notice he didn't touch up on that.
Right.
And so this is in and of itself evidence that the God of the Israelites had a name and that his name was indeed Yahweh. And then if Yahweh is the God of the ancient Canaanite, then it does make sense that when scholars tell you that there is Canaanite influence on these texts, that's indeed the case.
Gotcha. So if they used the God's names, then it would become evident that there are different God names, that there is a name of God, and there are times when the God is plural and has a
Right.
council and has a different name. But if you just say Lord, then it all translates to be the same, as
It
if it's
becomes
one.
it becomes very generic. So the very next, or the last text that we're going to look at from Heiser's video, Daniel 7:9, and he's going to play some very interesting tricks on it. So I'm going to have my Hebrew text ready to show you.
actually a crucial passage. And there's a lot of rabbinic discussion, a lot of intertestamental discussion on this. The passage reads, "As I looked, thrones," notice the plural, "were set in place, were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat." Now we know who the Ancient of Days is. This is God. So God is seated now. His clothing was white as snow, hair of his head like wool. His throne was fiery flames. Its wheels were burning fire.
Okay. So I don't know if you got this, but so far he's made some observations on the text. The first one is, because I don't want you to miss it, is he pointed at the fact that it reads thrones in the plural, which then later notice that is also in the singular. It shows up in the singular in the latter part of that verse where it reads, "His throne was of fiery flames."
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you can't really make much of the fact that it's using plural in that first throne, as if to say that, well, that means that there is plurality in the Godhead or something like that. And then he talks about the Ancient of Days, which is in his translation. And then he affirms that it is actually God, that God is the Ancient of Days. But the Ancient of Days is not generic God, is a very specific God. And that is the God El. And I want to show you this so that you can see it for yourself, that I'm not just making this up.
So was that terminology, Ancient of Days, referring to El and the Canaanite religion and the Canaanite text?
Yeah, the Ancient of Days is a title that is actually a title of El. It's a Canaanite reference to
In the
the
Canaanite
God
text?
El himself. Yeah.
Oh.
And so then you could make a prediction, right? If the Ancient of Days is having to do with the god El,
Mm-hmm.
then should we anticipate that the Hebrew includes El and not Yahweh?
Yes.
Let's read it. All right, so just to get our feet wet, this is from the New World Encyclopedia, where it reads: in ancient Canaanite inscriptions, El is often called Bull, Bull El, or the Bull God. And several finds of bull statues and icons are thought to represent this aspect of El worship. However, he's also often described or represented as an old bearded man, an image of God as the Ancient of Days. That persists in the Bible in Daniel 7:9, which, by the way, this is just me speaking now. It's the only occurrence in the Hebrew Bible, the only reference to God as the Ancient of Days. Continue on. Other titles of El include creator of creatures, father of the gods, father of man. He is also called creator eternal, as well as your patriarch, the gray bearded ancient one, one full of wisdom, king and father of years, and the warrior. So these are all titles that are part of this even more ancient Canaanite religion that was in practice for a long time prior to the beginnings of Judaism, where the same this deity named El had and was worshipped through all these different titles. Now you can get this from there are translations of several of these Ugaritic texts. One example is the Ugaritic Baal cycle. Here I'm reading from 1.3, verses 7 through 9, where you run into this. It reads, she came to the mountain of El and entered the tent of the king, the father of years. So there's that title there. Also in 1.2, we read 1.3, 1.2, verse 5, he penetrates or comes to the mountains of El and enters the pavilion of the king, Father Shunem, or Father of Years. Now, the question is, given that the only reference to God as the Ancient of Days occurs in the book of Daniel, how do we know that Daniel didn't have specifically Yahweh in mind versus El? How do we know that? Well, for that, we need to look at the text. Now, keep in mind that parts of Daniel, which I think the section from where that phrase comes from in Daniel 7, was originally in Aramaic. So the rendition of the God El, that word, that phrase, is slightly different than you're used to. When we say El, that's more of like the Hebrew version. In Aramaic is slightly different. It's Elah or something to that effect. So Daniel 7:9 says, as I looked on, thrones were set, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. Okay, so where is Yahweh here? Yahweh is not present. The book of Daniel uses two names or two things. One is the word Adonai in the Hebrew, which means Lord.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to the name of God or God, he uses El and Elohim. So you can see how on the left I'm highlighting this is El, Eloha, right here. Here it shows up El again. You can see at the very bottom of the screen, the little window pops up. It says, well, you have to read Hebrew. Um, and it's just El. There's no Yahweh in Daniel, is what I'm saying.
Now, his clothing was white as snow, hair of his head like wool. His throne was fiery flames, its wheels were burning fire. This is language drawn from Ezekiel 1, where it's very clearly God on his throne chariot. And so there's no ambiguity here. This is God. A stream of fire issued, came out from before him, so on and so forth. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. Now you say, well, what's the big deal? Well, if you go down to verse 13, I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man. And he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. So there's a second figure here. They're both in the same verse, Son of Man, Ancient of Days, but it's to the Son of Man that everlasting kingship is given. And we're going to talk about the description of coming on the clouds in heaven, because the Jewish community knew that that was an epithet, a title that you would give only to deity and only to Yahweh. But Yahweh is already in. So who's this other guy? And he's the Son of Man. In other words, one like a human being.
So, all right, let's see what else he's going to say
And
here.
Interested in it. The fundamental work written in 1977 on this is Alan Siegel's Two Powers in Heaven. Siegel was a Jew. He taught rabbinics at Brandeis for many years. He's now deceased. But what he wrote the book for was to answer a simple question. How did we lose this? How did we lose this doctrine? Like, what happened to change our theology? Because he was a student not only of the intertestamental material, but he was a student of rabbinics, and he knew that this was a discussion, and he knew earlier it had been an accepted part of Jewish theology. So he wanted to know, like, what happened? And his whole book is devoted to understanding when the Jewish community changed their theology and why. So if you have a Jewish friend who's used to reading academic material, this is a great book, to give them. It's by a Jew. It's not by a Christian. It's by a Jew.
And that's the end of his video. He points to this source, which he packages, he brands as a rabbinical source in modern times. He's actually misrepresenting it. I read the book, and I don't get what he's saying. Now, what's he saying? If I understood Heiser correctly, he's making the argument that this author discovered what was once forbidden, hidden knowledge, namely that God was a godhead and not this character Yahweh, but this something greater than that. And that it's just that the rabbis didn't want people to know about it, and so they kept it hidden. And he's sort of rediscovered it. And then he did so in order to understand when and how brought about that change in the mentality. Like within Jews, God was at some point understood as a godhead, but then that was changed. And I argue that that's not what the author does. In fact, what the author does, he points out, he highlights a tradition of a rabbinical rebuttal of such interpretation of God, and in how it was labeled as a heresy. And it was not that it was forbidden knowledge, but more so that it was forbidden to discuss or to believe or to contemplate because it's heresy, not because it was meant to be forbidden. So really, I'm really shocked to hear him sort of like represent the author, the original author, in that way. But don't just take my word for it. Let me show you some underlines that I did of the book so that you can see what I mean.
Yeah, total misrepresentation of what the book is saying.
Look, the book that he cited right here. Here's from chapter 1. He says, the intention of this book is not to find out when and why the thinking changed, like he said.
Yeah,
But
he's trying to paint it like, oh, here's what it's really pointing to, the two powers in heaven. That explains it.
And that other power is Jesus. So look, he says, is to collect and examine the rabbinic reports about the heresy of two powers in heaven.
Like, you shouldn't be painting God this way.
That's right. And to identify the proponents of the heresy. He then later makes the point that there were two sort of flavors of the same heresy. One was that you have like two complementary gods or two complementary forces working together, and the other one is you have two antagonistic or two contrarian forces, and that they both were labeled as heresies, and how that was the issue, and that's what the rabbinical evidence that Heiser is talking about actually addresses. They label it as a heresy. So he totally misunderstands or is misinterpreting the text. Here's another one. It says Heinrich Graetz began the study of the two-power heretics. He was attempting to relate the reports of Gnosticism and anti-Gnostic polemic in the writings of the Church Fathers, which reports of sectarianism and heresy in rabbinic texts. Because he then later talks about how this same heresy issue was part of the beginnings of early Christianity as well, but
It's right
only
there.
to describe how it's a problem and it's a heresy. Not that it was some forbidden knowledge that is on the text that they didn't want anyone to know anything about.
Right. Why wouldn't they want them to know if there was really this Messiah that's being prophesied in their text? Why wouldn't they want to know if this was pointing to this future Messiah? No, it's because
Exactly.
they don't believe that it's saying that, right? And that's why you shouldn't interpret it that way.
Right. Exactly. So there you have it, folks. Another response video to, in this case, not necessarily an apologist, but more of a Bible scholar acting as an apologist or doing apologetics in a very deceitful, concerning way. So,
Thank you for explaining to us what's really going on there and debunking some of the ways that apologists try to justify what's going on.
yep.
Appreciate your
So,
time. Thanks for watching, everyone.
yeah, thanks for watching. And this has been Apostate of
Of
Mind.
mind.
They call me a god.